Story 1: The Sinister Roommate. When my boyfriend and I first met Bob, he seemed like the kind of guy you'd want as a roommate. Friendly, laid back, and undeniably creative. He quickly won us over with his easygoing charm and knack for picking up new skills. Whether it was sketching detailed portraits or learning to play a musical instrument in a matter of hours, Bob's talents were almost hypnotic. At first, his quirks seemed harmless, endearing, even. But over time, those quirks began to fester into something darker. Something I could never have anticipated. The first sign of trouble came in small, almost laughable ways. Bob had this strange habit of burning things. It wasn't the kind of pyromania you'd see in movies, no raging bonfires or reckless destruction. Instead, it was methodical, controlled. I'd walk into the living room to find him hunched over the ashtray, holding a lit match against a strand of hair he'd plucked from his head or a scrap of paper he'd torn from a notebook. His expression was always the same, intense, focused, like he was conducting a delicate experiment. "What are you doing?" I asked him once, half joking. "Just curious," he replied, shrugging it off. "I like watching how things burn." At first, I dismissed it. Everyone has their weird little habits, right? But then there was the Easter Bunny. One of our friends had brought over a giant cardboard standee of a cartoonish Easter Bunny, something they'd rescued from a store display. It was meant to be a silly decoration for the living room. But within an hour of its arrival, we noticed smoke wafting through the front yard. Bob was out there, standing over the smoldering remains of the bunny, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Bob! What the hell?" my boyfriend shouted, rushing outside. Bob turned slowly, his face unreadable. "It was just taking up space," he said simply. It was unsettling, but not enough to sound any real alarms. Not yet. Then there was the thing with the animals. We had 2 dogs at the time, both sweet, friendly mutts who loved everyone. Or at least, almost everyone. They were wary around Bob. And for good reason. One day, I came home early from work to find one of the dogs limping. When I confronted Bob, he admitted, without a shred of guilt, that he'd accidentally shut the dog's leg in the door. Another time, I caught him casually flicking lit matches in their direction, laughing as they scrambled to get away. When I confronted him, he dismissed it as harmless fun. "You're overreacting," he said with a smirk. "It's just a joke." But there was nothing funny about the fear in their eyes. Things took a darker turn when a friend of ours dropped by unexpectedly. They found Bob in the backyard, holding one of the dogs by the collar. He wasn't hurting her yet, but the way he stared at her, the way his fingers gripped her fur a little too tightly, set off every alarm bell.
"I was just curious," he told me later when I demanded an explanation. "I wanted to see if she'd react differently if I only gave her bad attention. You know, like an experiment."
An experiment. The word sent chills down my spine. It all came to a head one night when Bob and I were sitting in the kitchen, eating dinner. Out of nowhere, he started talking about fear. "Do you ever think about how people react to pain?" he asked, his tone eerily casual. I frowned, setting my fork down. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Like, how they flinch. How their faces change. It's fascinating. Isn't it?" My stomach turned. "Bob, that's not normal." I said carefully. He shrugged. Why not? It's just human nature. Fear is a survival instinct. But it's also kind of beautiful. The way it takes over. How it controls you. I stared at him, speechless. Then he said the thing that still haunts me to this day. I've thought about it a lot. What it'd be like to see that fear in someone else. To cause it. My hands were trembling. What are you saying?
He gave me a slow, deliberate smile. I'm saying I understand now. Why some people do what they do.
I couldn't breathe. Bob. You need help. I said. My voice barely above a whisper. He laughed. Help? I'm not the one who's scared. That night, I told my boyfriend everything. We confronted Bob together, demanding that he move out immediately. He didn't argue. In fact, he seemed almost amused by the whole thing.
If you don't want me here, fine, he said, packing his things with an infuriating lack of urgency. But don't act like I'm the bad guy. I've never done anything to you.
But the truth was, it wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what he might do.
Bob moved out the next day, leaving behind a trail of unease that took weeks to dissipate. Even after he was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching us somehow. Still lurking in the shadows of our lives.
The dogs took months to fully recover. They were skittish, flinching at loud noises and avoiding certain corners of the house where Bob used to sit. And as for me, I never looked at people the same way again. Bob had been our friend, a part of our lives for months, and yet, we'd never really known him. Not the way we thought we did. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed or lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting across from you at the dinner table, smiling like everything's fine. Story 2: The Disturbed Neighbor. Moving into a new place is always a gamble. Especially when it comes to roommates. You hope for quiet nights and shared responsibilities. But sometimes, you get something entirely different, something darker. When I first moved into the apartment, it seemed perfect. The rent was affordable. The location convenient. And the master tenant, Sarah, was friendly enough. She was heading to Hawaii for a month, leaving me with Kyle, a new roommate she'd found through Craigslist. I didn't have much say in the matter, but he seemed fine at first. Quiet, polite, maybe a little socially awkward, but harmless, or so I thought. What began as minor oddities quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Kyle's strange behavior started about 4 days after Sarah left. I was woken at 8 a.m. by frantic knocking at my bedroom door. I stumbled out of bed, groggy and annoyed, to find Kyle standing there, his face pale and his hands trembling.
"So, do you want to tell me what went on last night?" he asked, his voice low and accusatory.
Confused, I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You know," he said, his eyes narrowing. "The screaming. The arguing. You and the landlord. Out in the alley." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Kyle. I was in bed by 9. I didn't leave my room all night." He stared at me for a long moment before muttering something about seizures and walking away. I chalked it up to sleepwalking or a bad dream. But then it happened again. The next morning, the knocking came earlier, more frantic this time. When I opened the door, Kyle launched into the same accusations. "I heard you last night. talking to the police, demanding badge numbers. What the hell are you talking about? I snapped. His expression darkened. You don't need to lie. I know what I heard. I shut the door in his face, my patience wearing thin. Over the next few days, Kyle's behavior became more erratic. He started pacing the apartment late at night, slamming doors and turning lights on and off. Through the frosted glass window in my bedroom, I could see his shadow moving back and forth, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. At one point, I heard him muttering angrily to himself, snippets of words that made no sense. She knows, they're watching. I'll show them. I began sleeping with my door locked and a chair wedged under the doorknob. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle was standing outside, listening. One night, he screamed my name, his voice hoarse and frantic. Why are you doing this to me? Why won't you stop? I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. The breaking point came around 1 a.m. a week later. I woke to the sound of slamming doors, louder and more aggressive than before. Through the frosted window, I saw Kyle pacing between rooms, muttering under his breath. Then, suddenly, he stopped. He turned toward my room, his shadow looming large against the glass. I can hear you, he said, his voice low and venomous. My breath caught in my throat. You really want to fight about this? He shouted, slapping the wall next to my door. Come out right now, and we'll settle it. I stayed frozen, clutching my phone in one hand and my car keys in the other. My mind raced. If I waited too long, he might break down the door. If I made a noise, he'd know I was awake.
Through the window, I saw him lean forward, pressing his ear against the glass.
Panic overtook me. I grabbed my bag and crept toward the door, my movements as silent as possible. My shoes were outside in the hallway, but I didn't care. Barefoot, I unlocked the door and eased it open. Kyle's pacing had resumed, his footsteps receding toward the living room. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway, grabbing my shoes as quietly as I could. But as I bent down to put them on, I heard him stop. Where are you going? I looked up to see him standing at the end of the hallway, his face shadowed but his posture tense. He took a step toward me, and I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was 2 blocks away, my feet bleeding from the rough pavement. I let myself into a friend's apartment with a spare key and collapsed on the couch, shaking uncontrollably.
The next day, I called Sarah and told her everything. She arranged for Kyle to move out by the end of the week. When I returned to the apartment, I brought 2 friends with me, just in case.
Kyle was gone, but the damage he left behind was chilling. The fire alarms had been ripped out of the ceiling, and the deadbolt on the front door had been carefully unscrewed and left on the table. Even after changing the locks, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I never stayed there alone again, and every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing.
Some people leave more than just physical scars. They leave you questioning your own instincts, your own safety.
Story 3: The Persistent Van. Nighttime walks always had a certain allure for me. There was a stillness to the world after dark, a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and eerie. I loved the quiet, the way the city seemed to hold its breath. But I never truly understood how vulnerable those empty streets could make me feel. On one particular night, I learned how quickly solitude can turn to fear. A simple walk home became a relentless game of survival when I noticed a van, silent at first, then persistent, following my every move.
It was around 9 p.m. when I left my friend's house. The visit had been routine: coffee, conversation, and some harmless gossip. The night was crisp, the air tinged with the first hints of winter. I zipped up my jacket and started my walk home. A familiar route that usually took about 10 minutes.
The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. Streetlights cast long, flickering shadows that stretched across the sidewalks. I was only a few blocks from home when I noticed the van for the first time. It was parked on the corner, its white paint faded and chipped. The kind of vehicle you wouldn't look twice at during the day. But something about it made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the way it was positioned, half hidden in the shadows. Or the fact that its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I kept walking, brushing off the unease. Cars park on corners all the time, I told myself. It's nothing. Then I heard it, the low rumble of an engine coming to life. I glanced over my shoulder as the van pulled out from the curb, its headlights flickering on. It rolled forward slowly, keeping a steady pace just a few feet behind me. My stomach tightened. I quickened my steps, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they lived nearby. Maybe they were heading out for the night, the same way I was heading home. But as I turned onto another street, so did the van. I decided to test it. At the next intersection, I made an abrupt turn onto a side street. It was narrower, darker, lined with houses that had long since turned off their porch lights. My pulse quickened as I listened for the van. There it was, the low growl of its engine, the faint crunch of its tires against the pavement. It was following me. My heart began to pound in my chest. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe they're just lost, I thought. Maybe they don't even realize they're making me nervous. But deep down, I knew better.
As I turned onto yet another street, the van continued its slow pursuit. The headlights cast long, menacing beams that danced across the pavement ahead of me. I glanced over my shoulder again, trying to get a better look. The van's windows were completely opaque, the kind of tint that felt deliberately intimidating. My mind raced with possibilities. Was there just one person inside? Or was there more than one? I clutched my phone tightly, but my fingers were trembling too much to unlock it. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But every instinct screamed that I was in danger. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer. They were picking up speed. Panic surged through me. I broke into a jog, then a sprint, my breath coming in short. Sharp gasps as I darted across the street. I didn't know where I was going, all I knew was that I needed to get away. The van sped up, its tires screeching slightly as it rounded the corner. I glanced around desperately, searching for somewhere to hide. The street was eerily empty, every house dark and uninviting. My chest heaved as I ran, my shoes slapping against the pavement. Ahead, I spotted a narrow alleyway between two houses. Without thinking, I ducked into it, pressing myself against the cold brick wall. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The van rolled to a stop at the mouth of the alley, its headlights illuminating the walls on either side. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't get out. For a moment, everything was silent. The engine idled softly, its hum vibrating through the air. Then,
The passenger door creaked open. A man stepped out, his silhouette backlit by the headlights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a deliberate, predatory slowness. "Hey!" he called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "We just want to talk." My blood turned to ice. I bolted from the alley, my legs burning as I sprinted back toward the main road. The man shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. The van roared to life again, its tires screeching as it sped after me. Ahead, I saw it, a small, rundown motel with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. The parking lot was dimly lit, but it was the only sign of life in an otherwise desolate neighborhood.
I veered toward it, ducking behind a hedge-lined courtyard. My chest heaved as I crouched low, trying to make myself as small as possible. The van screeched to a halt just outside the motel. I peered through the leaves, my heart pounding in my ears. The passenger door opened again, and the same man stepped out. He looked around, scanning the area, his movements deliberate. "You can't hide forever," he called out, his voice sharp and mocking. My breath hitched. Then, the motel's front door swung open. An older woman, likely the night clerk, stepped outside. She squinted at the van, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice cutting through the tension.
The man hesitated, his posture stiffening. He muttered something under his breath before retreating to the van. A moment later, the vehicle sped off into the night, its taillights disappearing down the road. I didn't move for several minutes, my body frozen in fear. Finally, I emerged from my hiding spot, my legs trembling as I approached the clerk.
"Are you okay?" she asked, her tone concerned.
I nodded, though my voice was shaky as I thanked her. She invited me inside, offering me a seat in the small lobby while I tried to compose myself. I stayed there for hours, too afraid to leave until the sun began to rise. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. Every time I see a white van, my stomach twists, and my mind flashes back to the headlights, the engine, and the man's mocking voice. What would have happened if I hadn't found the motel? If the clerk hadn't stepped outside when she did? I'll never know. But the thought chills me to this day. And just like that, Bob was gone. But the uneasy silence he left behind was more unsettling than his presence had ever been. 4 weeks. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining for the sound of a door creaking open, for the flick of a match in the darkness. The dogs would still tense at shadows that weren't there, their bodies stiff with a memory of fear that refused to fade. One evening, not long after he left, I caught myself staring at the living room couch, the spot where Bob used to sit. It was just an empty space now. No eerie smiles, no cruel experiments, no strange mutterings about pain and fear. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house still remembered him. One night, a single matchstick appeared on the kitchen counter. Neither my boyfriend nor I had bought matches in months. A joke? A coincidence? Or a reminder? I threw it away. But something in me knew that wouldn't be the last. What do you think? Had Bob just been a deeply disturbed man, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath his fascination with fear? Would you have noticed the signs sooner? Or would you, like me, have ignored the small warnings until they became impossible to overlook?
Let me know your thoughts in the comments, I read every single one. And if you enjoy stories that make your skin crawl and your heart race, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your fellow horror lovers. And subscribe to Wolf Tales for more true terror.
Because sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones we imagine. They're the ones we invite into our homes.